Welcome to the War Business Podcast, hosted by Matthew Brunnemann, the author, Brendan Clark, your consigliere for all things war, and Dakota Maynard, the Appalachian war wizard. War is a business. Some would even call it a racket. Every modern war and every business has a carefully crafted marketing image. The War Business Podcast breaches that veil so you can hear the real stories of the average Americans who fight our wars and drive the war industry forward. Our mission is to tell the stories of conventional warriors. Let the captains of the war industry share their endeavors and inform the listeners of current global conflicts. All three hosts served in the United States Marine Corps and hold well-informed perspectives of war and war business. This concludes your introduction. Stand by for the episode. Hey everyone, this is Matthew Brunnemann, the author. The War Business Podcast is going to bring you something a bit different today. This is going to be a project that I deliver on my own. I'm sure most of you follow or listen to the podcast for the other two hosts, and I do not blame you. But you are stuck with me for this one. As insufferable as I am, I'm going to give it the old college try to deliver you something worth listening to. The content and message will be good, but the voice and person bringing it to you is a separate issue. So kindly, I ask, don't shoot the messenger. Some of you may know that I served as an intelligence specialist in the Marine Corps, and I hold a master's degree in Homeland Security. For those of you who didn't know that, now you do. We're going to lean into those attributes a bit for this project. We're going to talk about terrorism. Terrorism of old, of present, and of the future. Specifically, I want you to be aware of terrorism in the future. Not because previous terror attacks no longer affect you, because they do. You know, the world that we live in now is a global surveillance state because of something that happened almost 25 years ago. However, there will be a terror attack in our future that will make us all forget about how much of a pain it is to go through TSA at the airport. I wrote my master's degree thesis on this upcoming attack. Effectively, what this episode is going to be about and what we're going to explore is my thesis. I spent a few months doing the research and the writing for the project, but really this was decades in the making since I relied heavily on my experience as an intelligence specialist to complete the project. Some of this content will be shocking or angering, and some areas you will believe to be false. But remember, I wrote the thesis and I deliver this message to you from the intelligence analyst perspective. What that means is, as an intelligence analyst, I give you the thoughts, beliefs, and motivations of the enemy. Not what I believe, but what they believe. The intel analyst has to get into the mind of the enemy to understand what they believe, understand what they think, and understand how they operate. This is a careful balancing act that always leaves the intel analyst looking like the bad guy, which is somewhat ironic since, the intel perspective is from the eyes of the actual bad guy. Let me give you an example. Let's look at the old practice of tree spiking. Eco-terrorists would spike trees to injure and maim loggers who were going to be cutting trees down. An intelligence analyst would submit a report or present to a commander the motivations of why tree spikers do what they do. Something like, "Sir, the tree spikers believe a logger does irrevocable harm to the Earth's ecosystem with each tree that gets cut down. The spiker believes that killing or maiming 100 loggers will stop the practice of cutting down trees, which would in turn save all of humanity." Something like that. Well, unfortunately, it is very easy for the intel guy to get an earful after saying that because it looks like the analyst is in support of tree spikers, when the exact opposite is true. The analyst is giving you the perspective of the enemy. The analyst doesn't sympathize with them or even think their logic is sound. That is why I said it is a careful dance that the analyst has to carry out. An intel guy has to suspend his own convictions and beliefs during the research period to truly comprehend what the enemy believes and to predict what the enemy will do. So, I say all of that to remind you that I'm giving you the perspective of the terrorist who will carry out this future attack. I definitely do not agree with what they say or what they believe, but I believe them when they say it. Some of this will be upsetting and some of it will seem completely false, but remember, the people who want to hurt us believe this to be true. They believe it to be true, so much so that many of them blow themselves up with suicide vests. I think that's enough of a disclaimer, so I will be speaking as an intel analyst and therefore giving you insight into what the enemy believes, but I do not believe it myself. However, I believe them and why they operate the way they do. So let me set the stage for this project. The United States of America will experience a coordinated terrorist attack that is so widespread that it occurs all across our homeland. The attack will be of unprecedented magnitude. It will last for about 72 hours, and we, the United States of America, will be relegated to a third world nation. As for what this episode will be exploring, we are going to look at the history of terrorism, who will carry out the attack, the motivations for the attack, the support behind the terror networks, the current vulnerability of the United States, how the attack will unfold, and when the attack will begin. Some of this is going to be fascinating to learn. A good amount will challenge your Western axiomatic dogmas, and some of this will just be deeply unsettling. I'll give you a warning when we get to the areas that might not be good to listen to before bedtime. Actually, I will do my best to remember to give you that warning, but if I don't give you that warning, just also remember that the terrorists won't give you a warning either. The last piece of stage setting is this. You need to remember or you need to realize a particular vulnerability of the American people. The nature of our government is to operate in secrecy so they can obfuscate their duties to the American people and the government's legal responsibility to adhere to the Constitution. The current disposition of the government and our national intelligence apparatus are now designed in a way to be your overlords because you cannot be trusted to know what is best for yourself or your family. And what I mean by that is this. The federal government could be expecting a terrorist to detonate a nuclear bomb tomorrow, and our government cannot and will not tell the American people. Like I said, you need to remember or realize that. With that being said, everything I will bring to you in this episode will be limited to open source information. Nothing I will discuss today will be classified. Only your overlords have all of the classified information about this attack. So without further ado, let's get on with the episode that we are calling The Attack. Let's start with our problem statement. The motivations for Osama bin Laden carrying out his attack on September 11, 2001, which were the U.S. support for Israel and the U.S. interventions in the Middle East, have only been exacerbated post-September 11, 2001. That means if you think the 9/11 attack is a thing of the past, then you are wrong and you have a fundamental misunderstanding of what happened that day. The correct framework to view 9/11 is as an ongoing attack. Additionally, the United States' domestic and foreign policies have given terrorists the opportunity to infiltrate the homeland. The Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, is facing a challenge greater than its capacity to address or thwart that attack in a timely manner. Each day that passes without the DHS dismantling the embedded terrorist cells within the homeland brings the United States one day closer to the attack. And every regime change war in the Middle East brings us one step closer to the attack. So we're going to unpack and explore each area of the problem statement, but for now, this would be a good time to dive into the history of terrorism. The idea of radical Islamic terrorism from the Middle East has become commonplace in the contemporary American zeitgeist since September 11th, 2001. It was there, a little bit before with attacks on the Cole, the previous attack on the World Trade Center, but most notably, 2001 ingrained that into the American way of life. The events on 9/11 were shocking. The subsequent decades of wars in the Middle East seared the threat into the forebrains of the American people, and the inception of the DHS has transformed the American way of life into one where the average American gives away certain liberties with the expectation of the American government protecting citizens from this never-ending threat. The terrorist networks responsible for the previous attacks are also responsible for the American perception of the perpetual danger. In addition to the attacks, terrorists have the primary goal of expressing a message. However, the primary goal of terrorism was not always to spread a message. The old age of terrorism in the Middle East did not intend to spread a message with their attack. Rather, the attack intended to prevent or deter a larger power from carrying out a specific action. The terrorists were not viewed as radical or religious extremists. They were just small bands of villagers or tribes that would use crude and catastrophic actions to counteract the will of a larger superpower. A historical example of this would be T.E. Lawrence, who was known as Lawrence of Arabia. The British military officer led a group of Arabs who rejected the expansion of the Ottoman Empire's colonial objectives. From late 1917 to 1918, Lawrence of Arabia led a series of small and quick attacks on the Hejaz Railway to deter the Ottoman Empire's expansion. The example of Lawrence and his band of Arabs illustrate how the old form of terrorism aimed to tangibly cripple a large power instead of the group trying to spread a radical ideology. While it is true that the old form of terrorism held ideologies based in religion and geopolitical interests, it is essential to understand that spreading the message and ideologies of the terrorist group were not the primary goal of the attack. Successful attacks, of course, would inspire others to join the group, which is a concept of badic communication, or a successful attack could inspire indifferent locals to reject Ottoman expansion through being emboldened, as is the example of T.E. Lawrence, but the successful attack itself was the primary goal. This is similar to militaries fighting each other and destroying critical infrastructure of the opposing military. When one side of the opposition does not wear a uniform, then it is perceived as terrorism. In fact, T.E. Lawrence and groups similar to him throughout the world were not even described as terrorists. However, he and those like him were historically described as using guerrilla tactics. The concept of guerrilla warfare is the conduit that links old forms of terrorism to the modern understanding of terrorism. Guerrilla warfare is defined as small attacks by small groups that lack the sophistication and coordination of conventional military operations. The connections between old terrorism and new terrorism is the surprise carried out by small groups. The new form of terrorism differentiates from the old form in that the new form of terrorism uses the surprise attack to communicate a message to the victims. The attack itself conveys a hate for the group, since most of the victims are blameless or have not personally carried out the grievance against the attackers. However, the attack is used as a mechanism to gain the attention of the victimized group or nation. Once the attention is gained by the shock and horrors of the event, The terrorists convey their message as to why they felt the attack was justified or necessary. The world witnessed or understood the new form of terrorism in the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, Germany, often remembered as the Munich Massacre. The Munich Massacre attack marked the first time that the world as a whole heard of the motivations of Middle Eastern terrorist groups, or specifically the Black September Organization. The BSO conducted the infamous Munich Massacre because they had a grievance that they wanted to express to the world. The BSO had historically conducted its operations in the Middle East and solely within the Middle East. The BSO then decided the world was not sympathetic enough to their grievances, nor did the world understand their plight. The terrorist organization decided to leave the Middle East and conduct the attack at the Olympics, since the eyes of the world would be watching and every newspaper would be writing about the Olympics. They capitalized on the attention and interjected their plight, through the horrific massacre to the eyes of the world. The BSO decided to carry out the attack against the Israelis at the Olympics because the world would have no other choice but to hear the BSO's message. The BSO carried out the attack to bring awareness to the nation of Israel's treatment of Arabs and Christians in Palestine and their treatment of Arabs and Christians in the broader Middle East. The Summer Olympic terrorist attack by the BSO marked a paradigm shift from Middle Eastern terrorists seeking to conduct their chaos to achieve their means, to Middle Eastern terrorists conducting chaos as a means of bringing awareness to their ideologies. Modern day terrorism uses the event to express their message. Calamity is as much of a goal as spreading their ideology. The rhetorical expression remained true with Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda attacking the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. The narrative from the United States government after the attack was that the Islamic terrorists hated the United States because we were a free people. George Bush said they hate us because of our freedoms. However, Osama bin Laden had an entirely different set of motivations for the attack. Unfortunately for Al Qaeda, their message would not reach the intended audience. The United States response was so massive that the terrorists failed to reach their goal of expressing their grievance to the American people. The only message that was received were that Al Qaeda wanted nothing more than to kill Americans and to cause chaos. The unheard message from Osama bin Laden, which was purposefully obfuscated by the United States government and the collaboration with media, is the foundation for the imminent and unprecedented terror attack that we will soon experience. So before we wrap up the history of terrorism, let's just recap and focus on the differentiation between old terrorism and new terrorism. Old terrorism wanted to just cause destruction. New terrorism wants to send a message. With September 11th, Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda were intending to send a message. The message that the United States people received was that the terrorists in the Middle East hate us because of our freedoms. That is one reason, and probably the main reason, why most people believe 9/11 is a one and done event. If you understand that Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda were intending to send a message, then you can start to wrap your head around the idea that 9/11 is an ongoing attack. And we're going to unpack and explore that a little bit more later, but let's just remember that 9/11 is not one and done. 9/11, or the attack, or why they were attacking, that is ongoing. So we can jump into the perpetrators of who will carry out this specific attack. Now, unfortunately, with the imminent attack and specifically the perpetrators or the exact groups that are going to carry out the attack, this is restricted to open source information. I mentioned that previously, but as we get into this segment, I'm not going to be able to say, Mohammed so and so is going to do this on this date and this time. So what we're going to do instead is focus on the terror groups and the networks that will carry out the attack instead of specifically which people are going to carry it out. So as for the perpetrators of the imminent attack will be radical Islamic terrorists. Unique to the imminent attack, the attack will be conducted by separate and distinct terror networks who have been planning and training together. In order to identify the networks and groups that are planning the attack, the first step in the identification process is to distinguish between Sunni and Shia terror organizations. We also should, visit and explore Wahhabist and Wahhabist terrorism, but that in itself is effectively something that Western civilization purposefully created, namely for, to be a force against the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan. But we are going to save that whole topic of Wahhabism for either a different episode or just for you to explore on your own. But for now, we will focus on Sunni and Shia terrorist organizations. The critical distinction will identify the terror groups and their respective tactics, which terrorist network leader might rise to the top as a power broker with influence over the disparate networks, and which Muslim nation states will support terrorist networks within their respective sect of Islam. The Muslim faith is bifurcated between Sunnis and Shiites and other groups as well, but effectively, there's left side and right side. Each side has their own, factions within that, but let's just stick to Sunnis and Shiites. The two set of sects do not get along with each other, which is an understatement. Their blood feud has lasted for, over a millennium, and the fighting between the two sects has the potential to prevent their terrorist groups from cooperating with each other. Historically, they've always just fought against each other, and, Sunnis and Shiites don't want to work together for anything. The feud will also prevent nation states that want to harm and cause chaos to the United States from supporting terrorist networks on the other side of the religious sect. The religious dispute began after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, when he did not leave a clear successor to be the religious leader. The Sunni followers believed that the leader should be chosen by the Muslim community as a whole, while Shiite followers believed that the successor should be a member of Muhammad's bloodline. The Middle East is filled with terrorist organizations from both sects. Some networks will collaborate with networks from the other sect out of pragmatism, and it is rare, while some groups draw a hard line that will prevent, intersect cooperation. Above all, both sects believe Israel and the United States to be the principal sources of malice within the Arab world. Now, I'm not discounting, the Muslim expansion to Western civilization and, the Crusades and everything that happened before, the late 1800s. But as for this attack and who wants to carry out this attack, we have to focus on, post 1900 ideologies with respect to Israel and the United States. However, one sect is far more brazen with its historical attacks on the United States and the West. The most successful terrorist attack on the United States to date was carried out on 9/11 by the Sunni terrorist group, which was Al Qaeda. Remember that they are Sunnis. Osama bin Laden and his Al Qaeda group were Sunni Muslims. The United States homeland has either been attacked or had military forces in open conflict with predominantly Sunni terrorist networks. Some of the notable groups include Al Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS, Al Shabaab, Boko Haram, and you know others. Al Qaeda was responsible for the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, the USS Cole bombing in 2000, um, and of course September 11th on the World Trade Center. The Taliban did not have any attacks on the U.S. homeland, but it was the principal combatant of the United States in Afghanistan for nearly 20 years. Now, you can look into why the Taliban was targeted. Obviously, there was coordination or sympathies that have a history between Mullah Omar, which is the leader of the Taliban, and bin Laden. Specifically, you're going to look at those two fighting with each other, fighting together in the Mujahideen against the Soviet invasion. So that's partly how and why the Taliban became the chief belligerent in the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. The ISIS network had many successful attacks on the United States due to its online radicalization program. ISIS used the internet and social media to recruit and radicalize new members to carry out decentralized attacks, such as lone wolf style knife attacks and car rammings and things like that. Their most notable attacks on the homeland were the 2015 San Bernardino shooting, the 2016 Orlando nightclub shooting, but ISIS is Sunni. As for the Al Shabaab network in Somalia, their conflict with the United States originated somewhere in the early 2000s, with its group being an offspring of the groups and events famous for the Black Hawk Down event in 1993. Boko Haram is an Al Qaeda affiliate in Africa that has been in conflict with the United States since 2011. And by conflict, there has been some, on the ground skirmishes. A lot of those with, special operations forces from the United States, ground pounding there. But mostly, it's just been, the United States raining bombs down on dirty terrorists. The majority of the United States wars and counterinsurgency efforts have been against Sunni terrorist networks, something key to remember here. However, there have been a few Shiite terrorist networks that have been in open conflict with the United States military. The Shia terrorist networks that were in open conflict with the U.S. most notably are Hezbollah and their offshoots. Hezbollah was formed in response to Israel's invasion of Lebanon and Israel's treatments of Arabs in the Middle East circa 1983. A little bit before that, but Hezbollah's open conflict began against the United States in 1983. There was a major attack in 1983 against the United States military. However, Shiites have never conducted an attack within the homeland of the United States. The initial clash between Hezbollah and the United States was in Beirut, Lebanon, when a suicide truck bomber detonated the truck at a U.S. Marine barracks, killing 241 Americans. Hezbollah attacked the barracks in response to the United States' support of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Israel went in, and the United States showed up as Big Brother to support them. So Hezbollah, although they were wanting to fight Israel, they saw that Israel could not, be successful without the U.S. Therefore, the U.S. is now a belligerent and now a target of their hate and ire. The, the Hezbollah motivation for the barracks bombing is key to understanding their current motivation and their historical ties to Al Qaeda. Osama bin Laden, the former Sunni leader of Al Qaeda, held the belief that a partnership with Shia Hezbollah organization is better for Arabs and Muslims than maintaining their religious divide. Both groups were founded for the same reason, to counteract Israel's treatment of Arabs, which led to a shared goal. The United States became a primary target for Al Qaeda and Hezbollah since the United States has supported Israel's foreign and domestic policies. The two groups share motivations, but they do not share the same strategic objectives or tactics. Al Qaeda maintained the strategy of conducting its attacks abroad to spread its message, while Hezbollah's strategy was to conduct operations solely within the Middle East to directly combat U.S. forces and Israeli operations in the Middle East. The alliance between the two has been predicted by many and expected by few. The average American, from the 1983 Hezbollah attack on the Marine barracks to the 2001 Al Qaeda attack on the World Trade Center, never really made a distinction between Sunni and Shia terrorists or Al Qaeda and Hezbollah. Just a terrorist was a terrorist. Whether the group was Sunni or Shia made little to no impact on the way the United States analyzed the threat. The generalized misunderstanding was that any terrorist group in the Middle East was willing and waiting to attack the homeland of the United States. However, that is a grievous error. The largest Sunni organization wanted to conduct attacks abroad to spread a message, while the largest Shia organization would only attack Americans who came into the Middle East. The error led to thousands of American troops being killed and wounded by Shia Hezbollah when the United States started conducting military operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, so on. The secondary effect of the error was not understanding that the United States could convince the two largest terror networks in the Middle East to fully ally with one another. The misunderstanding that the largest Sunni and largest Shia terror networks pose similar threats to the homeland has led to that misunderstanding now becoming accurate. The 20 years of invasions and regime change wars in the Middle East led to millions of Arabs dying and hundreds of thousands of Arabs being displaced from their homes and from their countries. The destabilization of the Arab world since 2001 has created a bond between Al Qaeda and Hezbollah, a bond that did not exist before 2001, but unfortunately exists now. Not only have the two groups set aside their differences for jihad, but many Muslims have likewise softened their opposition to the rival sect to address their perceived greater threats of Israel and the United States. The destabilization of the Middle East has increased the number of terror networks and the number of Arabs who are willing to conduct a massive attack on the United States homeland. The Al Qaeda network will serve as the strategic force behind the attack. Hezbollah, with decades of on the ground tactical experience fighting the American military in the Middle East, will be the tactical wing that will carry out the attack on the United States. In addition to strategic leadership of Al Qaeda and the tactical fighting force of Hezbollah, there is an unknown number of Muslim civilians who can potentially be inspired to join in on the ongoing attack by phatic communication. I briefly brought up phatic communication being something that happens post-attack. The attack inspires those who are already sympathetic or somebody who is on the fence to join in on the intent behind the attack, to partake in on the attack, or to conduct copycat attacks. Things like that. And unfortunately, due to all of our regime change wars post 2001, The United States has been importing all of these people, all of these Muslims whose homes we have destroyed and livelihoods and families that have all been destroyed. We've been importing those people to the U.S. So we have been importing people who are susceptible to being inspired to partake and proliferate on the imminent attack. As for the motivation for the imminent attack on the U.S. homeland, the average sentiment of Muslims in the Middle East and those who have fled to the United States for asylum is that the United States deserves to be attacked or destroyed. The average person in the Middle East has seen their livelihood and people destroyed for 20 years by the United States and for 70 years by Israel and even longer by settlers before Israel was formally a nation. Although very few need to be convinced to justify the imminent destruction of the United States, this was not a common sentiment for the average Muslim in the Middle East before the September 11th, 2001 terror attack. The Middle East had been destabilized to a much smaller degree by Israel since the 1950s. However, the destabilization exponentially intensified during and after the United States global war on terror beginning in late 2001-2002. The motivation landscape for a massive attack post-2026 looked much different than it did before September 11th, 2001. The willingness for Hezbollah to attack the homeland of the United States had yet to exist before 2001. The only major terrorist network willing to attack the United States abroad or in the homeland of the United States prior to 2001 was the Osama bin Laden-led Al-Qaeda, which was a Sunni group. In keeping with the new form of terrorism, bin Laden's two goals had a rhetorical component and a long-term horizon. The infamous letter titled Letter to the American People was penned and published by Osama bin Laden. And this letter stated his plight for the world to understand why his terror group felt the need to use violence against the United States. The letter explained that the United States had been assisting Israel in killing tens of thousands of Arabs in the Middle East since the early 1980s. It's kind of, I was going to say funny, but that is inappropriate. It's kind of important to note that he cites the 1980s as being when his plight began, because before that, the United States was training, arming, and in direct partnership with bin Laden in his fight against the Soviet Union when they invaded Afghanistan. Bin Laden, the Saudi Arabian rich kid, decided to go join the jihad, and because of his wealth and family status in the Middle East, he was a Middle East commander, and a Mujahideen commander, and the United States decided to partner with him. So in his letter to the American people, he cites that, hey, I've been mad since after we were working together. But further in his letter, the attack on the World Trade Center was meant to cause harm and to bring awareness to the American people so that the American government would understand that they had been party to the death of Arabs for decades. Although bin Laden intended to cause death and destruction to the American people, he knew that the attack would not stop the American government's ability or desire to wage wars in the Middle East. This leads to the secondary and long-term objective of bin Laden's September 11th attack. The long-term vision of bin Laden was to use the terror attack to bait the United States into destroying itself. This was the same tactic that bin Laden used when he was a Mujahideen fighter in Afghanistan fighting against the Soviet Union. Osama bin Laden had been an asset of the Central Intelligence Agency during his fight against the Soviets. The CIA used and funded bin Laden and a few other key leaders in order to drain the Soviet economy by remaining engaged in a prolonged and expeditious war. Effectively, what bin Laden was trying to do to the United States, bait the United States into going abroad, fighting a costly war that took way too long, and the United States being worse off than before they went abroad. The tactic of forcing the Soviet Union to destroy its own economy for an unnecessary war was the same, or is the same, long term strategy that bin Laden sought to enact with the September 11th, 2001 terror attack. The Al Qaeda group could not destroy the United States in open conflict or basically at all, but it could bait the United States into destroying its own economy through years of prolonged war. The tactic was that of a leader of the old guard, but bin Laden was killed in 2011. The death of Osama bin Laden was significant to the terrorists of the Middle East because it represented a changing of the guard of radical Islamic terror leaders and a paradigm shift in the objectives of terror networks. Hamza bin Laden, one of the sons of bin Laden, has emerged as a new figurehead of Islamic terrorism. Terror groups in the Middle East are disparate and somewhat sovereign, but the regime change wars of the United States in the last 25 years have unified the separate terrorist networks. With Hamza at the helm, Islamic terrorism has reverted to the in-state goal of terrorism from sending a message back to forcing an immediate change. This is very important to remember coming up when it comes to analyzing the imminent attack. Old form of terrorism wanted to achieve a specific end, whereas the new form of terrorism wanted to spread a message, with Osama being the old guard being done and away with, and Hamza, his son, being the new guard, the new leader of terrorism. There's been a reversion back to the end state of old terrorism, where they want a specific result now. In addition to changing the intended outcome of the attacks, the new guard of terrorists use much more sinister, brazen, and devastating attacks. The motivations for a catastrophic terrorist attack by Middle Eastern terrorist networks have deepened since Osama bin Laden's 9/11 attack. In fact, the motivations for the impending terrorist attack on U.S. soil have compounded on top of the motivations that led to the 9/11 2001 terror attack. The terrorist networks in the Middle East believe Israel and the United States make life worse for Arabs. This belief has taken the form of propaganda promulgated amongst the Arab population of the nations in the Middle East. Israel's continued military actions in Palestine and its efforts to destabilize Iran have only affirmed or reinforced the terrorist propaganda to the Arab population. Additionally, the United States invaded Iraq and Afghanistan and carried out regime change wars in Syria and Yemen, Libya, and so on. The regime change wars devastated the civilian populations of the host countries, which reinforced the terrorist propaganda that the United States is evil. Not only have the motivations for the terror organizations increased, but so too has the number of people who are willing to punish the United States. And we have imported many of those people. The number of people in the Middle East who have a desire to carry out the attacks of reprisal against the United States has exponentially increased by an unknowable number. Unknowable because it's hard to track that many people, and unknowable due to phatic communication, the amount of people who may or may not be inspired. In each of the regime change wars, a direct consequence has been Muslim Arabs fleeing the Middle East and receiving asylum asylum in the West. The West has given asylum to people who hold the potential to be radicalized into terrorists. ISIS proved that the internet is a viable way to find, inspire, and direct individuals to carry out jihad against Western nations. The United States appeared to cease the military campaigns and operations in the Middle East with the withdrawal of military forces from Afghanistan. However, Israel's current military campaign in Palestine has proved to the Muslim world that the United States is still more than willing to continue to support Israel's foreign policy. Israel's war in Gaza is inflaming the rage of the Muslim world, which directly puts the American people at risk of a massive and catastrophic terrorist attack within our own homeland. The United States is providing the weapons, the bullets, bombs, rockets, missiles, artillery, and tactics needed for Israel to conduct operations in Palestine. In addition to the American munitions and ordnance being used by Israel, the United States has sent multiple fleets of warships to the Middle East to fight the Houthis in Yemen. The Houthis, which are a Shia terrorist network, began targeting civilian cargo ships and NATO warships in the Red Sea as a response to Israel's war in Palestine. The United States sent multiple fleets into the Red Sea, conducted naval bombardments and airstrikes on the Houthis in support of Israel, and it should be noted and remembered that we left packing. The Houthis, basically the literal caveman with rockets, sent our naval fleets packing out of the Red Sea. In keeping with typical Shia terror network behavior, the Houthis are only attacking Western nations that enter their part of the world to support Israel. The Houthis made this expressly clear that they would stop attacking cargo ships and our warships if we stopped supporting Israel. The Houthis are a rebel force that rose to power after the United States supported the Saudi Arabian regime change war in Yemen. Regime change wars lead to a power vacuum once the government is overthrown and or destroyed. Oftentimes, or essentially every single time, a terrorist faction rises to power to fill that governmental void. We just saw this once again in Syria, where an Al-Qaeda commander and ISIS commander in Syria was installed as the new president of Syria when Bashar al-Assad fled to Russia. And this ISIS commander, Al-Qaeda leader, who we had a $5 or $10 or $20 million bounty on, became the president after the regime change and was invited into the White House to shake hands with the president in the Oval Office and to play basketball with troops that he was just killing a few years before. Whether the people of the destabilized country truly support the terrorist leaders or not is a secondary reality to the fact that a new sheriff is in town. Case in point, once again, the Al-Qaeda leader, who is now the president of Syria, went on to kill countless Christians and Druze people in Syria. So a toppled government and the subsequent rise of a terror group as a governing force is the reality for Yemen, and the Houthis reign Yemen with impunity and are the dominant military force in the country. The Houthis are a Shia faction and they are backed by Iran. Iran is a major enemy of Israel, which means the Houthis will inherently be against anything related to Israel. And Iran and Israel weren't always enemies. They were, I wouldn't say allies, but Israel was buying a lot of oil from Iran, and also Israel was sending a lot of weapons to Iran. We saw this openly and then also in an underhanded fashion when during the Iran-Contra scandal, the weapons that were going to Iran were coming from Israel. Israel was sending Iran weapons. Now they are major enemies. So anything that Iran objects against in respect to Israel, the Houthis will support Iran in their endeavors. And so the latest example of the Houthis' opposition to Israel is the Houthis' vow to attack any warship or civilian cargo ship that comes into the Red Sea to support Israel's operation in Palestine. The United States has legitimate global interest in keeping the shipping lanes in the Red Sea open. However, since the attacks in the Red Sea are in retaliation for Israel's war in Palestine, any military operation in the Red Sea by the United States is perceived as a direct support of the Israeli military. The Middle Eastern terror networks and the broader Arab world perceive the United States' support of Israel in Gaza, Palestine, as a continuation of the Arab plight dating back to at least the 1950s and before that. The American CIA directly supported Osama bin Laden in the 1970s and 1980s to help collapse the Soviet Union, which he later understood as interventionist policy in the Arab world by the United States. The United States' support of Israel's invasion of Arab nations since 1950s and specifically in 1980s led to bin Laden perceiving the United States as the support vector of the Middle East's greatest threat. That perception was galvanized by the United States wars in the Middle East in the 1990s and the United States war in Kosovo that killed many Muslims. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda needed no further motivation to carry out their grand plan of baiting the United States into decades of war in the Middle East. The attack on 9/11 proved to be successful for Al-Qaeda, not because the towers fell, but because the United States willingly decided to drain the purchasing power of the US dollar through far too expensive wars in the Middle East that took far too long. Consequently, to the United States destroying the Arab world for 2 decades, the average Arab, radical or not, looks at the United States with vitriol and a lust for vengeance. The Arab hate and discontent for the United States is at an inflection point with Israel's war in Gaza. The United States and Israel do not see any issue with the way the war is being conducted in Gaza. However, the only thing that matters in terms of motivation for a terrorist attack is the perception of the terrorist networks and the broader Arab world. Once again, I remind you of the intelligence analyst perspective. Not to say what I believe, but to say what the people who want to hurt us believe. If you don't know what they believe and their motivations, how can you ever speak to them or come to any understanding? If you two are speaking 2 different languages, no pun intended, then you will not come to an understanding. And the only way to end any conflict is to kill all Arabs, which, if that's what the United States wants to do, then it should openly state that and gear itself and frame war in that way. But just to do regime change wars and things like that only makes the situation worse. The terrorist networks in the Middle East and Muslims around the world perceive the Israeli war in Palestine and Gaza to be a genocide. Once again, that's their perception. So for a deeply religious people, terrorist or not, the Muslim population can only stop the Israeli destruction of the Arab world by eliminating the Israeli benefactor. being the United States. The destruction and total collapse of the United States is necessary for the Arab world to secure peace from Israel's foreign policy. So let's recap the motivation for the imminent terrorist attack on the United States homeland. The Arab world perceives and is motivated by what they perceive, which is the Arab world has been destroyed, or at least is worse off after Israel's, let's say, Middle East destabilization post 1950. Not only do they believe that, but it is their perception that the only way that Israel could destabilize the Middle East is by having Uncle Sam be the big daddy that gives Israel the money and the weapons and things like that, and effectively the security to act with impunity in the Middle East. So you have the Sunni and Shia divide that has, been around for 1,500 years. They have always hated each other. They had around 1900s, but specifically, let's talk about post 1950s. There was a common enemy, that being Israel, and what is happening to the Arab world. And since Israel can only destroy the Arab world, we are now the target of the United States is now the target of the terror attacks. So Sunni and Shia have had their historical divide. Osama bin Laden had a desire that he expressed to terror groups on the Sunni and Shia aisle that he wanted them to coalesce, or at the very least stop killing each other for long enough to kill the Americans. But since Osama bin Laden was taken out of the equation in 2011, a new rise to power has occurred. Chiefly one of his sons, Hamza bin Laden, and Hamza and the other terror networks that currently exist in the Middle East are more brazen with their attacks. So you have bin Laden, who wanted to drain the United States, to bait the United States with 9/11, bait the United States into conducting a prolonged and protracted war abroad to destroy our own currency and our standing in the world. You have that which you could say did or was not successful, but that intent has transcended into, let's just destroy the United States. We need to make an attack so brazen and so devastating that the United States cannot project force, cannot project support to Israel in the Middle East. And for the upteenth time, once again, this is the perception of the people who want to kill us. Not my perception, not the War Business podcast perception. This is the perception of the people who blow themselves up and kill innocent people. So the motivation for the upcoming attack on the homeland is to just once and for all cease the United States' ability to project power abroad. So we can get into the support of the different terror networks now. The support of the terrorist networks who will carry out the attack will come from state actors who traditionally support terrorist networks and any group that stands to benefit from meeting the needs of terrorists. State actors have long supported terrorist organizations that share the same geopolitical endeavors. This is even true of the United States, as evidenced by the CIA's support of Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen in the 1980s. As far as Middle Eastern terror networks in the 21st century, the biggest nation-state supporters of terrorist organizations are Iran, Pakistan, Qatar, now Afghanistan, and now Syria. The non-state actors who support the terror networks preparing to carry out the attack are the cartels in South America and Mexico. And we've seen cartels move people, specifically terrorists, but other people through the open borders from 2020 to 2024. But the cartels moving people across the border is a decades-long endeavor. The state sponsor of terrorism varies by Sunni and Shia ideology, as well as the degree of support the state will give. The largest state sponsor is Iran, a Shia government, which supports the Shiite terror network Hezbollah. Iran has a military arm known as the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC. The IRGC has a long-standing history of supporting terrorist activities in the Middle East. The IRGC was the military arm that supported the jihadis who killed and injured United States service members during the global war on terror. Some of these jihadis, like the now current president of Syria. The jihadis in Iraq would receive funding, weapons, munitions, bomb-making supplies, training, reinforcements, and everything else from the IRGC. The military disposition in Iran is not as cut and dry as that of the United States, and so the IRGC could be perceived as a rogue element of the Iranian military, although the Iranian government had made no effort to curtail the IRGC. The Iranian support of terrorism was understood by the West to be facilitated by the IRGC. Although Iran was known to support terrorism, the blurred lines and other geopolitical factors that led to Iran being cast as a hostile regime while remaining free from outright invasion of the United States. In 2019, the Trump administration officially put the IRGC on the Foreign Terrorist Organization list, the FTO list. The Iranian government was subjected to more sanctions by the United States in retaliation for its terror networks and terror nexus in general, but the government was left relatively untouched. However, the IRGC did not fare as well. The FTO designation gave the United States government the legal authority to carry out military strikes against the IRGC without having to declare open war on another nation's military. The United States took direct action against the leader and commander of the IRGC. While the IRGC commander Qasem Soleimani was in Iraq, the United States conducted a targeted airstrike that resulted in his assassination on January 2nd, 2020. Look into that type of Hellfire missile. It's pretty sweet. The United States had the legal justification to carry out the strike since the commander was designated as a terrorist leader, and the strike did not take place on Iranian soil. The assassination was seen as a significant victory for the United States since Soleimani was an integral part of the IRGC's support to terror networks. However, the success was short-lived as terror networks do what terror networks do in the Middle East, and they have filled that void and are no less capable today than they were before the assassination. And Iran is still the dominant state sponsor of terrorists in the Middle East. Another state sponsor of terrorists in the Middle East is Pakistan. Pakistan is another nation that is known to aid and abet terrorists without experiencing international repercussions. The United States allegedly invaded Afghanistan for harboring Osama bin Laden. The harboring and invasion led to a nearly 20-year war in Afghanistan. However, in the first few months of the war in Afghanistan, bin Laden left Afghanistan and took refuge in Pakistan. The United States knew bin Laden was being harbored by Pakistan, but it remained in Afghanistan for 2 decades, and the United States never invaded Pakistan. In addition to harboring bin Laden, Pakistan was known to be a safe haven for other Sunni terrorist leaders. For example, in the years that I was in Afghanistan and the years preceding and following my time there, it was no secret that Taliban senior leadership would reside and run their operations out of Pakistan. The leaders of the Taliban would leave Afghanistan to meet and coordinate in the Quetta region of Pakistan. This region of Pakistan was also known to facilitate training camps to jihadists on how to construct bombs. Pakistan's support of terror networks was known to the United States and to NATO. However, the political and military will did not and still does not exist to stop Pakistan's support of terror networks. A similar level of terror network support to that of Pakistan exists in Qatar. The United States considers Qatar an ally, has military bases in Qatar, and runs a major State Department hub in Qatar, while knowing that Qataris support terror networks. The main terrorist network supported by Qatar is Hamas. The Hamas organization operates in Gaza, which is the principal aggressor against Israel and Palestine. Hamas is also the group that carried out the October 7, 2023 retaliatory attack against Israel, which led to the ongoing Israeli military operation in Palestine. And although Hamas only fights in Israel or Gaza, it receives praise and support from Al-Qaeda. Hamas and Al-Qaeda are linked in their ideological aims of stopping Israel's influence in the Arab world. Hamas, as small as it is, finds itself as a nexus point for state-sponsored terrorism from Qatar and Iran, as well as the support from major terror networks in the Middle East, chiefly Al-Qaeda. So focus on Hamas being a nexus and a bridge between Shia state sponsorship and Sunni terror cells like Al-Qaeda. Once again, just evidencing the unprecedented and horrible coordination between Sunni and Shia terror networks and ideologies that did not exist before 2001. The Hamas nexus to state sponsors of terrorism and the war in Gaza creates a precarious vulnerability for the United States. What were once disconnected terror networks are now joined in their effort to stop the United States wars in the Middle East and the United States support for Israel. The terror networks that aim to attack the United States to protect the Arab world receive support from non-state actors for attack preparations. Organizations like the cartels specialize in smuggling humans and smuggling contraband into the United States. The cartel has been known to smuggle humans into the U.S. for decades, and it has been known for decades that the cartel have complete operations set up across the U.S. And by operations, I mean owning buildings, logistical hubs, paying off law enforcement and government officials, and that type of network has been set up in the United States, and the United States has known about it for decades. And their safe havens and operation centers and bribery operations within the United States homeland has also been known for decades. The cartels do not have to be sympathetic to terrorist jihad to make money in the facilitation and smuggling of terrorists and their weapons into the U.S. The same is true of smuggling weapons of mass destruction or small arms necessary to carry out the attack. If there's money to be made in smuggling, the cartel will do it. The politicization of the United States border policy and the classified nature of terrorist operations have made scholarly articles impossible to find regarding the number of known terrorists being apprehended at the border. There are, however, news outlets and independent journalists who have reported on known terrorists being apprehended at the southern border between 2020 and 2024. It is alarming that academia has taken one side of the political position while demonizing the other side of the political aisle to the point of no longer conducting objective studies or approving peer reviewed articles of anyone brave enough to publish or speak of this. What is more alarming is that the southern border of the United States was mostly open from 2020 to 2024. Millions of foreign nationals declared themselves to DHS personnel at legal checkpoints, but the inadequate DHS infrastructure prevented the proper screening and vetting. Furthermore, it is unreasonable for a terrorist to declare themselves to DHS personnel. It is far more reasonable to expect terrorists to have entered the United States through the unguarded parts of the border, which was the vast majority of the border, or it is reasonable to expect them to have paid cartels to smuggle them in. The open border policy and the known intent of Middle Eastern terror organizations make the 2020 to 2024 Biden administration complicit in the imminent terror attack, allowing millions of foreign citizens to enter the United States without being properly vetted at DHS checkpoints or to enter the unguarded areas with impunity puts the American people at risk. The entire purpose of the DHS being created in 2002 was to safeguard the United States from terrorist attacks, particularly through the border. The DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas was completely derelict in his duty to safeguard the United States through his open border policy. During this period, Americans needed to show government identification to board an airplane or to prove themselves not to be a terror threat, yet a foreign citizen could enter the United States without proving they were not a terror threat. These policies made the 2020 through 2024 administration passively complicit, at best, in supporting the imminent terror attack through their shared values of having an unsecured border. The last cohort of people who will support the terror attacks are the foreign Muslims who entered the United States as a result of fleeing the destabilization of their home countries. Those who did not flee to the United States with malice are vulnerable to radicalization through the internet, through social media, and through phatic communication. ISIS proved to the world that anyone can be radicalized through their cell phone or through their computer. ISIS would use social media to find and connect with potential recruits. The potential recruit would either continue through the radicalization pipeline or not. Furthermore, the Muslim foreign citizens who did enter the United States with malice in their hearts will be radicalized once the attack begins. The attack will begin, and the chaos that will ensue will be the phatic communication necessary to inspire like-minded Muslims to join in on the punishment of the United States. One other cohort that would or could potentially be inspired to partake in the attack were the first stages of the attack, and this is uncomfortable to discuss and uncomfortable to even entertain in my tiny brain. This cohort would be the amount of people who hate America, and I'm speaking of Americans or people who were naturalized, people who are here that demonize white people, demonize the United States as colonizers and things like that, and we're on stolen land and all that. Those people are susceptible to phatic communication. Seeing the United States being just broadly on fire or being blown up, unfortunately, would inspire them to express the beliefs that are already in their hearts. Break, break, break. Time for a 5-minute gear check, boys. This would be a good time for you to like, share, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow, and we would really appreciate it. Don't forget that we want to interview veterans, so reach out to us if you want to have your service documented. Let other veterans know too. You guys can use the comment section, our socials, or the podcast email. Find us and follow us on X, Instagram, Facebook, and Substack. And go buy yourself a copy of War Business, The Hired Guns of Helmand Province. You can buy that on Amazon or through the Wargate store. If reading isn't your forte, then we've got you covered with the audiobook. Thank you for listening to this episode of the War Business Podcast, and we appreciate all of your support. Let's get you back to the episode. So let's recap the support of the terror networks who would carry out the operation. So the terrorists who would carry out the operation are most likely going to be the terrorists that have on-the-ground tactical experience fighting Americans and other Western forces in the Middle East. So we're looking at Shia networks. These guys are already trained and proficient in fighting and also have experience in how the United States fights. So we have Shia terror networks. Now, as for the support, we have seen an unprecedented rise in Shia support from Sunni Muslims, and this was evidenced in the Hamas attack on October 7th, 2023. So Hamas and that attack, but Hamas being a nexus between Shias and Sunni support for training, logistics, planning, strategy, things like that. And then also the state sponsors that supported Hamas, even though Hamas was working with terror networks on the other side of the Islamic sect divide. So we can move into the state sponsors. So we have the just general state sponsors of Iran and Pakistan. Iran, who has been a state sponsor of terror networks since at least the 80s, at least since the Shah was overthrown. You also have Pakistan. Pakistan was known to harbor bin Laden for 10 years and harbor Taliban senior leadership, but the U.S. never once did anything about that. The United States invaded Afghanistan because of their support of Al-Qaeda. Then Al-Qaeda received, safe harboring for a decade. At least bin Laden received safe harboring for a decade, and the United States did absolutely nothing about that. And Pakistan continues to support terror operations. There's also Qatar supporting Hamas. And the other state sponsorships are new state sponsors that were created directly because of the United States interventions in the Middle East. I'm talking about the Taliban now being the ruling power of Afghanistan, and with our $86-90 billion of weapons and whatnot that we left in Afghanistan, that is now at the disposal of the Taliban, not to mention the $80 million the United States government pays to the Taliban every single week. You can look at bills by, let's say, Representative Tim Burchett, who is trying to cease the payments of $80 million to the Taliban every week, but for whatever reason, the United States government will not pass that bill. And we also have Syria. Syria now being a state sponsor of terrorism, chiefly because the new president of Syria is a former Al-Qaeda commander and ISIS commander, and he was installed as the president when we helped Israel overthrow Syria, and Bashar al-Assad fled, and a ISIS commander, Al-Qaeda commander, has assumed the presidency of Syria, and President Trump welcomed that ISIS commander, Al-Qaeda commander, into the White House to shake hands and take pictures in the Oval Office and let that guy play basketball with American troops, even though he was killing and maiming them just a few years prior. And the other sponsorship for the attack will come through non-state sponsors, just effectively the cartels helping smuggle people in, smuggle weapons in, things like that. Our own open border policy and the administration who was complicit in allowing people to flood in our border, even though they, some of which could be reasonably expected to have malice and hateful intent in their hearts. And also the United States just, I don't want to say actively, but I would say passively bringing in people who are willing to hurt us. And I'm specifically talking about our asylum programs after we've destroyed countless countries in the Middle East. We destroyed these countries, people are radicalized, but we allow them to flee here and live here. But we can even look at Somalia. Somalia has been in the news as of late because of their corruption, but Somalians were not even a thing in the United States before the U.S. had intervened in Somalia, especially with Black Hawk Down in the 90s, but that wasn't even, Somalians in the United States weren't even a thing until our intervention over there, and now there are millions of them here. And the last bit of support for the terror networks would just be the people I just mentioned, the Muslims that are here that may or may not want to actively punish the United States. Some do, some don't, but some will be inspired by their religious brethren who will carry out the attack. So now we can move into the vulnerabilities of the United States. The United States is vulnerable to a massive attack by terrorist networks from the Middle East due to our own foreign and domestic policies. The foreign policies of the United States have increased the vulnerability over the last 25 years by increasing the number of people willing to attack the United States and displacing those people from their home countries. There are now more people willing to attack the United States than there were before September 11th, 2001. Additionally, many of the people willing to attack the United States have had years of experience in guerrilla warfare tactics, fighting the American military, obfuscating military checkpoints, and bomb making and other activities. As for the domestic policies, the United States has willingly imported known terrorists and people sympathetic to jihad, and the United States has neglected to fortify the critical infrastructure necessary to safeguard the homeland. The number of people who have fled the Middle East as a result of the United States wars in the last 25 years is hard to estimate. The Watson Institute for International Affairs at Brown University published a study in 2020 that estimates 38 to 45 million people in the Middle East became refugees between 2001 and 2020. Some people have been able to seek refuge in neighboring countries, but many of those neighboring countries have also been subjected to regime change wars. Additionally, the Arab world is not monolithic, and the nations are sovereign, which means the neighboring countries have the right to refuse asylum to any number of people that would overwhelm the host country's infrastructure. The sheer volume of refugees has led to millions of Muslims from the Arab world immigrating to the Western world and the United States. A typical propaganda narrative in the United States was that the wars in the Middle East were meant to prevent radical ideologies from infiltrating the United States. I was party to this propaganda narrative. Part of why I had joined the Marine Corps was I was of the common belief that we got to go fight wars there to keep them over there and to keep them out of our country. However, we know that millions of them came to the U.S. because of our wars. The government propaganda narrative is in direct conflict with the known second-order effects of war, which are the displacement of people and the creation of asylum seekers. In some regard, there is a moral argument to make that an economic and military superpower has an obligation to provide for the people that have been displaced by the superpower's wars of choice. However, this moral argument does not account for the religious incompatibility of the superpower and the displaced nations. According to a Pew Research study, the number of Muslims living in America who were born outside of the United States has increased by 400% from 2001 to 2024. By no means are all Muslim people ready or willing to attack the United States for religious ideology, but displacing tens of millions of Muslims who view the wars as based on religious ideology increases the number of radicalized Muslims who have immigrated to the United States. A key issue that increases the vulnerability of the United States to immigration and asylum from the Arab world is vetting. Many of the countries that the United States wars of choice have destabilized did not have the social infrastructure in place to track and identify their citizens. An example of this would be the United States war in Afghanistan, which had significant challenges in identifying and distinguishing Afghans as friend or foe. The country did not have a driver's license or identification card system, a system analogous to Social Security numbers or criminal record system. In fact, the country did not have a uniform naming convention, which meant a person's name could change based on their occupation, trade, religious development, or really any other reason. This was a very big issue for us in Afghanistan, trying to identify and track people, and we would have to, me being an intel guy, would have to carry biometric devices to scan people's irises and fingerprints and take DNA to say, hey, have you ever been party to making an IED, or were you previously captured? Things like that. There's no identification. They couldn't just say, hey, I'm John Smith. They would say, hey, I'm John Smith, but why would you believe them? There's no way to prove it. So we had to use biometric devices. And this is the same issue that we run into when allowing millions of these people from similar countries come into the U.S. There's no way to vet. Many other Arab nations share this practice. It is a common way of life for them that does not create social problems, but it is a conundrum for the United States. The United States has zero ability to identify asylum seekers beyond the names given by the refugee. If the names of millions of refugees from the Arab world cannot be identified, then the United States cannot properly screen that person for a criminal history or a terror nexus. And even though the United States knows of this security gap, it still accepts refugees at the expense of guaranteeing the security of the American people. Another vulnerability of the United States is a concept known as insurgent math. The insurgent math framework was built out of the early 2000s wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The concept grew out of the precarious nature of fighting a counterinsurgency and accounting for how many people from the local population are friendly to the United States and how many people were hostile to the United States. The goal of a counterinsurgency is to win the will and support of the people indifferent to the insurgency. The problem with fighting a counterinsurgency amongst a civilian population is that civilians are easily motivated to ally with the insurgency, oftentimes resulting from the deaths of civilians and insurgents. The basic equation of insurgent math is this. If there are 10 insurgents and one insurgent is killed, then the new total of insurgents is 19 instead of 9. Insurgents are members of the local population, so killing one will radicalize all of his male kin. The crude model is both theoretical and true, and it presents a danger to the United States. Any asylum seeker or refugee who has entered the United States since 2001 as a result of the war or a war has the potential to be radicalized and sympathize with jihad as the Arabs in the Middle East continue to die from Israeli and American operations. The foreign policy of the United States for the last 25 years has increased the vulnerability of the United States to a greater degree than it was before September 11th, 2001. The domestic policies of the United States have been neglected to the point of high vulnerability. The issue of importing people willing to attack the United States has already been discussed. The same is true of the border policy from 2020 to 2024 that has allowed known terrorists with the intent to destroy to come into our homeland. Additionally, the open border of 2020 to 2024 has provided the opportunity for weapons, munitions, bombs, and other supplies needed for the attack to be brought into the homeland. What has not been discussed are the vulnerabilities of our critical infrastructure. The domestic policies of neglect and procurement have jeopardized the critical infrastructure. The electrical grid of the United States is critical to nearly every other sector of the critical infrastructure. Without electricity, the hospital system cannot function. Without electricity, the banking system cannot function. So too goes the communication sector, the manufacturing sector, the defense sector, the banking sector, emergency services, government, and water and waste management sectors. Rendering the electrical grid obsolete or ineffective is the key to bringing down the American government and the American way of life. Unfortunately, the vulnerability of the electrical grid makes it an easy target to attack. The electrical grid is interconnected through power substations, and the substations are independent upon one another. Sadly, the vast majority of power substations are only guarded by a chain link fence if they are guarded at all. A chain link fence is easy enough for a terrorist to infiltrate with a can of gasoline and a few matches. Nor does a fence stop a terrorist from using a gun to shoot and destroy the substation. Using power substations as an attack vector to destroy the electrical grid is far easier than Americans would be comfortable with if they knew the government continues to neglect fortifications. A simultaneous attack on only 9 power substations will destroy the entire national electrical grid. It is estimated, optimistically, that it would take at least 18 months and international support to restore the power grid if further calamity and chaos did not ensue. The significant vulnerability, catastrophic second and third order effects, and the ease of access make the electrical grid a prime target for the imminent terror attack. Power substations are also vulnerable to attack by destroying transformers along power lines and along public streets. The power lines and transformers have zero protection. They are vulnerable to destruction from physical attack, but the United States government has welcomed another vulnerability. The United States has been buying transformers from China since 2006. President Trump issued Executive Order 13920 in May of 2020 to cease American procurement of critical infrastructure components from China after it was discovered that a Chinese manufactured transformer had a backdoor built into the hardware that would allow China to control the transformer remotely. The Biden administration suspended the executive order in 2021 and began buying transformers from China again. Although terrorists are unlikely to use the Chinese backdoor into the electrical grid, the fact remains that the United States government is aware that the electrical grid has serious vulnerabilities. Once again, proving the United States government's domestic policies are passively complicit in maintaining the vulnerability of the American people. Recapping the vulnerability of the United States is pretty simple. We have foreign and domestic policies of our own choosing that have made us extremely vulnerable to a terrorist attack. We've allowed people who do want to hurt us to come into the United States through different policies. As for how they can attack us, the electrical grid is a prime attack vector. The United States knows full well that there are both cyber and physical vulnerabilities to our electrical grid, but the government does nothing about that. The sinister aspect of that is how easy it can be to physically attack and destroy our electrical grid. We saw this in California a few years ago in around the San Jose area, where some guys with AK-47s shot some rounds at a power substation, knocked it out. It took over a month for one substation to be brought back online. As the study showed, if 9 specific power substations are destroyed simultaneously, the entire power grid for the United States goes down for at least 18 months. 18 months if we get international support in bringing it back online. If that happens, nearly every other critical infrastructure goes down as well. No more banks, no more water purification, no more government services, no more emergency services, no more oil refinement, and so on and so forth. Additionally, the population as a whole would not survive the power grid going down for even a month, but 18 months, no way. How many people are on insulin? How many people are on medication that they need to take from day to day, week to week, month to month to survive? If the power grid goes down, so do those people. The heat, the cold, things like that kill people. Not having that will kill more citizens of the United States. Same with not having a hospital system or having clean water, running water, sewage, wound treatment, things like that. If the electrical grid goes down, the United States goes down. And the electrical grid is extremely vulnerable. So we should probably move into how the attack will unfold. This is where I was supposed to give you that warning. This will be probably tough for me to deliver and harder for you to hear. So you are warned, be prepared. I will say some heinous things, I suppose, but what your imagination will do will be worse than what I say. So if there are kids listening, this would be a time to stop. And if you are going to bed, pause it and resume tomorrow. But let's get into how the attack will unfold. The imminent attack will unfold over a series of 3 days. The attack will be decentralized and comprised of terrorist cells or teams that are already embedded within the homeland. The attack will begin and be carried out in stages. The beginning and completion of stages being the only form of coordination. The type and scale of attack will be reflective of the old form of terrorism when sending a message is not a priority or the main objective of the attack. The method of attack will be the use of small arms, improvised explosive devices, IEDs, rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, gasoline, hammers, knives, and club-like hand weapons. Some of the attacks will be sophisticated in nature, while other Elements of the attack will be carried out as targets of opportunity. The Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023 is a good framework, although much smaller in magnitude, to understand the sophistication and coordination and planning of the attack. Hamas used a sophisticated plan, extensive coordination, and an unprecedented array of weapons. Hamas began the attack with a barrage of thousands of rockets. Then thousands of fighters infiltrated Israel by homemade gyrocopters, vehicles, and watercraft, air, land, and sea. Some of the Hamas attackers were already in Israel in preparation for the attack. Once the attack was underway, Hamas used small arms, drones, explosives, and kidnappings. The attack on the United States will not be identical in scope to the Hamas attack on Israel. The level of sophistication, the array of weapons, and the tactics will be similar, but the attack on the United States will be scaled up to meet the geographic demands of the homeland and to achieve the primary goal. The imminent terrorist attack will have the intended objective of bringing down the perceived source of destruction of the Arab world. The primary objective of the attack is to eliminate the United States' ability to interfere in the Arab world. The first day of the attack will be the most important in terms of success for reaching the attack objective. The attack will begin on the electrical grid infrastructure. The destruction will occur at power substations across the country. Very few need to be destroyed to bring down the power grid, but many more than necessary will be destroyed to lengthen the time it takes for the United States to bring the electrical grid back online. The terrorist cells that will destroy the electrical grid will not be the cells proficient in small arms tactics, as the electrical grid is relatively insecure and easy to destroy. The weapons used in this stage of the attack will be small arms, IEDs, and gasoline. The power substations that cannot be infiltrated will be attacked by gunfire from a distance, or the terrorists will use explosives to breach the barriers. Explosives can be used to destroy the power substations, but cans of gasoline are equally proficient. Destroying the electrical grid will render obsolete the rest of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors that are dependent upon electrical power. The first day of the attack will also see the terrorist cells with experience fighting the United States military in the Middle East attacking our military bases. Unbeknownst to the average American, military bases do not allow soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to carry weapons on base. Military personnel are only allowed to access weapons during scheduled training events. Weapons are locked away in armories, with very few personnel having access to the keys necessary to open the locks. Also, ammunition is not stored with weapons. The only people with immediate access to firearms on military installations are the few military police personnel who are tasked as gate guards. Although these personnel are trained in using pistols and some rifles, maybe shotguns, their duties as gate guards mean they are not trained in basic infantry tactics or trained to repel assaults. The unguarded nature of military installations make them primary targets for the first day of the attack. Terrorist cells who have experience fighting American troops will be able to infiltrate the installations and slaughter servicemen before the servicemen can gain access to weapons. The weapons used in this stage of the attack will be vehicle-borne IEDs, drones, and small arms to gain entry into the base. Small arms will be used to attack unsuspecting and unarmed military personnel. RPGs and IEDs will be used to defeat military equipment, such as vehicles, tanks, helicopters, planes, and jets. Gasoline will be used to set fires in targets of opportunity, maximize chaos, and occupy military personnel. Taking out the military on the first day is a priority because the military would be armed and mobilized by day 2. The second day of the attack will be focused on the critical infrastructure that runs on alternative energy sources and the first responders who will be attempting to restore order. Day 2 of the attack will see attacks on hospitals, fire stations, law enforcement stations, and government buildings. Although the attacks will be nationwide, the priority targets will be the major population centers and state capitals to cause mass death and chaos. Cities like Los Angeles, San Diego, Sacramento, Phoenix, Seattle, Houston, San Antonio, Chicago, Jacksonville, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., New York City will be principal targets on day 2 of the attack. That list is not exhaustive, but it drives the point home pretty well. The major population centers, first responders, and government centers have the most critical infrastructure. Terrorist cells with experience in small arms tactics and explosives will be necessary for day 2. The weapons used in this stage of the attack will be small arms, drones, RPGs, explosives, and gasoline. Small arms will be used to attack law enforcement personnel and unarmed civilian targets of opportunity. Drones will be used to look for targets and identify law enforcement movements. Explosive drones will be used to attack critical infrastructure buildings, generators, first responders, and civilian targets of opportunity. RPGs will be used to destroy law enforcement vehicles, first responder vehicles, and distant critical infrastructure targets. Explosives will be used to breach barriers, destroy vehicles, destroy hospitals and government buildings, and destroy critical infrastructure targets. And gasoline will be used to destroy hospitals, government buildings, critical infrastructure assets, and create maximum chaos. Destroying these targets on day 2 is necessary to prevent or delay the United States governmental ability to respond and recover from the attack. Day 3 of the attack will be the most sinister. This stage of the attack will have the primary objective of causing death amongst the civilian population. The electrical grid and other critical infrastructure sectors will have been rendered obsolete. The military's ability to meaningfully respond will have been significantly disrupted, and the first responder infrastructure will no longer be viable. With these targets destroyed during the first 2 days, the civilian population will be slaughtered on day 3 without organized resistance. The vulnerability of the civilian population on day 3 will see unskilled terrorists and many Muslims seeking retribution join in on the jihad. The madness of crowds, the phatic communication from successful attacks, and the inspiration to join the jihad will inspire an unforeseeable number of Muslims living in the United States to join the attack on day 3. There are 2 more sources of potential terrorists on day 3. The first source is the radicalized left wing who protest on college campuses in support of Gaza or out of vitriol for Israel. The second source of potential terrorists who will partake in the mass slaughter of Americans is the radicalized left wing who demonize white people, protest under the ideology of America being stolen land, and hold the belief that the concept of American sovereignty is evil. The third day of the attack will effectively be mass murder carried out by terrorists, radicalized Muslims, and certain Americans with deranged ideologies who want to see the country burn. Day 3 will be the most sinister of the 3 days of the attack because it will be a slaughter of the civilian population. The weapons in this stage of the attack will be small arms, explosives, gasoline, knives, and club-like weapons. Small arms will be used by skilled and experienced terrorists and by any new collaborator who recovers weapons from slain military, law enforcement, and civilian defenders. Explosives will be used by skilled terrorists to attack targets of opportunity and to breach ad hoc barriers put up by any resistance. Gasoline will be used to burn down buildings, displace civilians, and cause maximum destruction. Knives and club-like weapons will be used by terrorists the inspired Muslims who recently immigrated to the United States, and any collaborator sympathetic to the destruction of the American people. As previously stated, the third day of the attack will be the most sinister since the primary targets will be civilians and the primary objective is to cause as much death as possible. Well, I did warn you about how the attack would be and the lack of colorful language that I would use. I kept it pretty brief and did not detail, all of the gratuitous nature of what would happen in the attack, but I used general terms from a military perspective and just general terms to try and paint the picture for someone of the civilian population to understand. You'll never understand what calamity is if you've never been privy to it, and hopefully you never have. But I think it's important to know that people who want to carry out this attack and the millions of people who have come to the U.S. and could be, phatically communicated into joining this attack, those people have lived a small scale of this, and they, have seen abject destruction of their homeland, and um, who wouldn't want to persecute those who did that to them? Again, I am not in support of them or this, but it is part of the role of an intelligence analyst to dive into the mind of these type of people. And speaking of these type of people, I just used the limited gratuitous nature of describing the attack to kind of paint a picture of what type of people we're talking about that come from this region of the world. They are completely different than us. Their values, the way they see life, value life, treat life, is completely different than ours. I would say incompatible. I'll take that to my grave. But just to let you know that them carrying out this attack, these people wouldn't walk away from this attack with PTSD. They would walk away from this attack feeling elated or as if they have done some great service. So just keep that in mind when you think about the millions of people we're importing into our country. The last part that I want to get into is when the attack will begin. And this is uncomfortable to say and to speak on for different reasons. But once again, I have to double down on the fact that this is from the perspective of them. Now, this segment that I'm going to get into now will be uncomfortable for sure, but because of our Western axiomatic dogmas, and specifically on Israel and the Middle East, such a sensitive topic in the United States, but it is an important topic, and it shouldn't be one where you say, shut up, racist, shut up, anti-Semite. This should be something where we understand the consequences. It should be something where, whether you're for it or against it, you should understand the arguments on both sides of the aisle. So when we go dive into when the attack will begin, I focused on geopolitical triggers that would enrage the terror networks. Not enrage the average American or anything like that, but what can happen in the Middle East that would make the terrorists say, now is go time. So let's get into when the attack will begin. The attack will begin based on geopolitical events. The motivation for Middle Eastern terrorism for the last 70 years has been Israel's destruction of the Arab world. The United States became a target of Middle Eastern terror networks as a result of the United States' support of Israel and the United States' direct meddling in the Arab world. The United States experienced its first major attack by Middle Eastern terrorists when the United States put military forces on Lebanese soil in support of Israel's invasion of Lebanon. Hezbollah, a Shiite network, used a truck filled with explosives to destroy the Marine barracks in 1983. The Shia terrorists held the strategy that they would only carry out operations within the Arab world. The United States first experienced terrorist attacks outside of the Arab world by Sunni terror networks. The Sunni networks held the ideology that their attacks should be conducted abroad and in the territory of their enemy. The Sunni networks believed their message would be better heard by the enemy if the attack occurred on enemy soil. The largest and most successful group of Sunni terrorists was and remains Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network held the same motivations as Shiite terrorist networks, but they diverged in operational strategy. The Sunni and Shiite terrorist networks are equally motivated by the actions of Israel and the United States in the Arab world. The motivations for Middle Eastern terrorism still exist to this day. According to the terrorists, Israel has been unjustly toppling Arab governments and killing Arab civilians. The average Arab was not opposed to Israel having a sovereign nation in the Middle East. Instead, the grievances were the destabilization of the Middle East and the killing of innocent Arabs. After Israel's war in Gaza and the unprecedented volume of photos and videos on the internet and social media, the average Arab in the Middle East perceives the nation-state of Israel to be an existential threat. Further, the United States is now perceived as an existential threat to the Arab world by funding and arming Israel for 70 years, and the United States using the last 25 years to further destabilize the Middle East through direct military campaigns. The United States' continued military presence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen illustrates to the Arab world that the United States has zero intention of leaving the Middle East. Likewise, Israel's campaign in Gaza is proof that Israel's treatment of innocent Arabs will not cease. Israel's decades of desire to convince the United States to overthrow the government of Iran is further proof to the terror networks that Israel remains an existential threat within the Middle East. The United States had been reluctant for decades to directly strike Iran because the risk to reward ratio of war with Iran does not benefit the United States. However, the United States and Israel jointly attacking Iran in June of 2025 illustrates to the Arab world that the United States is fully willing to enter another lengthy and bloody war with a near-peer adversary to support Israel's destabilization of the Arab world. Israel's and the United States' military operation in the Middle East have been the historical antecedents to terrorist attacks. Accordingly, future terror attacks will be a result of Israel and the United States military operations within the Middle East. Unless the United States ceases giving military aid and financial support to Israel, the Middle East terror networks would still attack the United States even if the United States pulled out of the Middle East entirely. The United States will neither stop supporting Israel nor pull out of the Middle East. Currently, the two main focal points of military interests for the United States and Israel are Palestine and Iran. Israel's operation in Palestine have been the historical precedent for Middle Eastern terrorism since the 1950s, arguably before, but that depends on what side of the aisle you are on. Israel's current operation in Palestine, which is leading to the complete destruction of Gaza and the deaths of tens of thousands of people, seems to culminate or serve as a finality to what Israel began in the 1950s. The complete conquest of Palestine has a high probability of being the geopolitical event that triggers the massive and catastrophic terrorist attack on the United States. First, the Middle Eastern terror networks would perceive themselves and their 70 years of holy jihad as failures if Israel finally accomplishes the destruction of Gaza and the annexation of Palestine. Second, the full annexation of Palestine will change the motivations of Middle Eastern terror networks from trying to stop Israel into retribution and reprisal. Since Israel could not have destabilized the Arab world or conquered Palestine without military aid and financial support from the United States, Israel's destruction of Gaza or the complete annexation of Palestine has a high probability of triggering the attack. The second geopolitical event in the Middle East that would trigger the attack in the United States is war with Iran. A regime change war, or a standard war between the United States military and the Iranian military, will suffice. A regime change war in Iran, where the United States uses proxy forces to overthrow the government of Iran, has a lower likelihood of triggering the attack than a traditional war. However, the possibility is still high since Iran is the largest state sponsor of Hezbollah. Hezbollah will perceive the proxy war as a threat to their own benefactor, and whether the United States has American boots on the ground or not matters very little to a terrorist network. On the other hand, a traditional war between the United States and Iran has an extremely high probability of triggering the attack in the United States. The chances of Iran defeating the United States are very low in the traditional military sense. However, the chances of the United States defeating Iran become extremely low if the United States homeland is destroyed. If the attack occurs during war with Iran, the United States would not have the ability to support the war effort in Iran while trying to simultaneously rebuild the homeland. There is another event that would trigger the attack in the homeland, and it blurs the line between geopolitics and religion. Jerusalem is home to the highly sensitive religious site that is currently home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Jews revere the site as a top religious priority since it is the site where the first and second temple were erected. It is a religious priority for the Jews to construct a third temple on the Temple Mount. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is the third holiest of religious sites in the Islamic religion. If a third temple is built on this site, then the Al-Aqsa Mosque has to be altered or destroyed. The alteration or destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque will inspire the Islamic faith to fight a jihad in a manner that has not been seen since the Crusades. Since Israel cannot do anything meaningful without the military aid and financial support of the United States, the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque is another geopolitical event that would trigger the massive and catastrophic attack on the United States homeland. So that's going to wrap it up for the geopolitical triggers or potential triggers for the imminent terrorist attack. I kind of moved through that fast because it is a sensitive topic. It is inflammatory depending on, what denomination of Christianity you are or what political aisle you're on, things like that. It's just extremely hard to talk about, but I find it to be very important, specifically with the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the potential for a third temple. So though that region has had, 1,500 or more years of blood feud and fighting between the Jewish religion and the Islamic religion. So something as pinnacle as a mosque, the third holiest site, being brought down so another religion can erect a holy site for themselves, that is very contentious and inflammatory. If we go back to the first part of when the attack would begin, the first two triggers, they were the destruction of Gaza or the annexation of Palestine. So what would happen with those? If those happen, it has the potential of turning Muslim terrorism from new school terrorism of, hey, look at me, I'm going to do this horrible thing so you can understand my plight and our plight in the Arab world. It's going to take it from that to, okay, I guess we lost, and now we will punish you. If you look at the BSO and the Munich massacre, that was the first time that the world kind of understood that, hey, um, terrorism is going to be used to communicate a message. Prior to that, terrorism was used to achieve an end state. Now, if annexation of Palestine or complete destruction of Gaza happens, there's no more plight. There's no more, hey, stop making this happen, because it has completely happened. So the mechanism or desired end state of the attack is no longer a message, and it devolves into, you will now punish, or you will now receive the punishment for the worst thing that could happen in our religion, and that type of thing. So those are the geopolitical triggers that I foresee in my assessment that would start the imminent terror attack within the homeland. As I said before I listed out the potential triggers, this is such a sensitive topic, and generally when anyone brings up that topic, it is met with being called hateful, a bigot, an anti-Semite, a racist, this and that. And that is extremely unfortunate. This is a very important conversation that should be had. All I care about is my family and my country, and I want what is best for us. And if that is continuing to support Israel, then we should hear that argument. But if there's an argument to be made that it is ceasing the support of Israel and that's what's best for our homeland, then we should be able to hear that argument as well. Unfortunately, the conversation does not go that way. Actually, the conversation doesn't really happen at all. So keep these geopolitical events in mind as we see the war in Gaza. It seems to be coming to an end. I mean, Gaza is pretty much gone now. Maybe the annexation of Palestine, I don't really foresee that happening anytime soon. However, still a geopolitical trigger. And then the Al-Aqsa Mosque or Third Temple being erected. Very, very religiously contentious to both parties in the Middle East, both, I guess you could say, belligerents. Those are arguably the most important things to them would be their religion. So the alteration or destruction of one holy site for the other religion's holy site, that is not going to end well or peacefully. So keep those geopolitical triggers in mind, and we'll just wrap up everything we discussed on the imminent terrorist attack in the homeland of the United States. I do want to thank everybody for listening to this special series, if we want to call it that, special type of episode brought to you by the War Business Podcast. I did say the content would be interesting and good, thought-provoking even, maybe. But also I did say that, person delivering it would probably let you down. So if you listen to all of it, great. I hope you took something from it. If you listen to all of it in spite of having to listen to me deliver it, then God bless you and your ears. I chose this topic for my master's degree thesis because I find it to be of extreme importance. You could say I was a little bit disillusioned after, a few deployments to the Middle East in Afghanistan, Helmand Province, interacting with the people, trying to accomplish our mission, win the hearts and minds, establish democracy, and, trying to do that. And there were, we were sold a bill of goods that I didn't, at the time, I thought maybe, we could accomplish it or maybe not. And then I went and deployed a second time, and it's like, oh, gosh, no way. I mean, we were being told so many lies, and I kind of just walked away from it, came home, left the service, and kind of just wrote the war in Afghanistan off, war in Iraq, and, I had my own issues to deal with, which it took a little bit of time to do. And so then, once I was back in a healthy state, I started reapproaching the wars in the Middle East. hey, why were we there? What was it we were trying to accomplish? Did we accomplish it? What was going on in Iraq? What was happening in Afghanistan? What was going on in Syria and Yemen? So you look into things, and unfortunately, through outlets like WikiLeaks or a few other um, sources that gave us more information than what state-sponsored media tells us, you start to realize that there were some other things afoot, and that just opened my eyes a little bit more to trying to understand why we were there, which maybe we may or may not never know. I'm not saying I know all the answers as to why, but having been there, I do have a good understanding of the consequences of our actions, but also the consequences of our actions that would be delivered by these type of people, what they want to achieve, or just their general thoughts on life or religion or state of being, and how they value life or do not value life, and that's just the average person from the Arab world. When you get into some of the terrorists and just the abject evil that they promulgate, that they I guess are, but the evil spirits that animate them, it is deeply unsettling. So I really wanted to understand, if we're going to interact with these people and with their affairs, how is that going to affect me today? How is that going to affect my family, my little kids? Wanted to know that, wanted to explore that, and through that exploration started understanding that, hey, maybe the reasons why they did the attack were not what we were told. So just looking into that more, trying, as I said, trying to be an intelligence analyst and understand it from their perspective. Not that they're right or that um, their beliefs are true, but understanding that they truly believe them. And it is quite sinister, and quite sinister as to what they want to achieve. So I dove into the thesis to really educate myself. I wanted to challenge myself, and in that process, specifically for the thesis and the few months of research in there, I really had to, in keeping with being an analyst, dispense with some of the beliefs that I had about them and what they believe and their motivations. And it was unsettling, not to be just because of I felt like we were sold a wrong bill of goods, but just understanding what they actually believe, and quite honestly, just how wrong they are, but how committed they are to it. It is very unsettling and very sinister. So I hope that everyone listening, or just our lawmakers, policymakers, decision makers, just begin to understand that there are consequences to these actions. Bringing all these people, we go start a war, then we bring millions of them in here, into our countries, into Western civilization, the degradation of Western civilization, and the incompatibility of those people with our way of life. I want the West, our country, our lawmakers to understand that just wars of conquest or destabilization, or if it truly is, in fact, just because we support Israel, it will have consequences on us. And I hope I am wrong. I hope my assessment as to the fact that we will be attacked, I hope that's wrong. I hope my assessment as to the magnitude of the attack, I hope that's wrong. I hope my assessment on their desire to completely destroy us, very much hope that's wrong. Unfortunately, there are some things that I am not wrong about. Bringing in people that do want to hurt us, having an open border that did allow terrorists to come in and some of their weapons, and the vulnerability of the United States, specifically our electrical grid. It is quite unsettling to think of all of the downstream effects of something that would happen if that electrical grid goes down, not just for terror reasons, but solar flares or whatever whatever, if our electrical grid goes down, our way of life is done with. It is going to cease to exist. So, in some ways, I am mad that our lawmakers have allowed it to get to that point. In other ways, not surprised, but the fact that we have spent trillions of dollars on the Middle East, and look at our power grid, is deeply unsettling. But I just, again, thank you everybody for listening. I hope you weren't too unsettled, or maybe you were just unsettled enough to think about it a little bit more, and maybe influence some of your decision makings as far as politics, or your decision makings and as far as how you want to prepare for your family, what you potential for where you see the world ending up, shaping up, or what the United States might look like in 5, 10, 20 years. With the podcast, all we're trying to do is make the American people a little bit smarter from the perspective. Let me walk that back. Make the American people a little bit more well informed from the perspective of dudes that served and went to war, or enlisted to go to war. We just want to make the American people a little bit more well informed, and we want to preserve some of that institutional knowledge that unfortunately thousands of Americans died to learn, and tens of thousands more were wounded to learn. So it would be a travesty if we forgot some of the lessons that came out of the Middle East. That is going to wrap it up for this episode. Thank you to everyone who listened, and we will catch you again on the next episode. The War Business Podcast is brought to you by Matthew Brunnemann, Brendan Clark, and Dakota Maynard. Editing by Stephanie Maynard. The theme song is California Wind by Bruno E. The War Business Podcast cover art is the copyrighted property of the War Business Podcast. The book, War Business, The Hired Guns of Helmand Province, is copyrighted by Wargate Books. Wargate Books is not responsible or liable for any material or conversations produced and expressed by the War Business Podcast.